So this is continuing with the idea of more politics in the United States and how that was very important at the time in the late 60s through the 70s. And what's important about this is to remember from last time that the 60s were incredibly turbulent, especially in 1968. There was a lot of social issues, political issues, global security issues, concerns about the Cold War, a lot of change, and people were just really tired of all of the rights revolution, all of the change going on, the challenges to traditional culture. And the kind of the backlash, if you could call it that, I guess is a good way to refer to it as, against all of the turmoil of the 60s is what's known as the conservative turn that happens in the late 60s and into the 1970s. And that's sort of a push back towards more conservatism and away from all of the upset of the 1960s. So we're going to look a little bit about that today and explore it and kind of trace how that develops in the political scene. So one of the biggest faces, most well known with this, is Richard Nixon. So let's look a little bit about how he came to be. Why is Nixon the face of this conservative turn? So we'll look at Nixon a little bit there. He was right there, given his double peace signs in the beginning. But let's look at a little bit of the background of Richard Milhous Nixon here. He's a Republican, and he had some political background, but he started really come on the national political scene when he becomes a senator from California, and Dwight D. Eisenhower runs with him as his vice president, and he becomes Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president from 1953 to 1960, and they ran on a kind of a silly Ike and Dick was what they went as on their political platform. Eisenhower was Ike and Richard Nixon was Dick, so Ike and Dick you had, and they really ran on a very staunchly anti-communist, very safe, very wholesome kind of image that they projected during the 1950s. And Nixon really did a lot more than a lot of other vice presidents had. Eisenhower was older. He liked to kind of stay home and he was playing his golf and stuff. And he sent Nixon out to go do some of his foreign relations work. If you recall that kitchen debate with Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier, that was Nixon over in Soviet Union. He was over there dealing with Khrushchev and kind of being the face of the nation abroad while Eisenhower was at home. So Nixon got a lot of political experience as Eisenhower's vice president and really kind of established himself as very anti-communist, very traditional, and pretty decently well respected uh, with Eisenhower. However, when Nixon decides he's going to try to use his political leverage as vice president to run for president in 1960, when Eisenhower's terms are up, he actually loses, despite having been a fairly decently popular vice president and having the kind of the blessing of Eisenhower. He loses the 1960 presidential election to John F. Kennedy, and part of it is because Kennedy projected this air of kind of youthful change, and in 1960, people were ready for that. They wanted change. They wanted rights revolutions and new things. Because after the 50s, there was some doldrums. People were kind of tired of the conformity and the fear, and JFK promised a bit of a change, so people were eager for that. So Nixon ended up losing that election in 1960, and then he tries to run for governor of California again in 1962 and loses that as well. So a lot of people feel that at that point, people thinking about Richard Nixon in the 60s kind of thought of him as a bit of a washed up politician that didn't really have any other chances. But he has a comeback in the late 60s because after all of the turmoil of the 60s, Vietnam, uh, issues with race, issues with the Cold War, all of this, he's a very good, very wily politician. And he reads the room well, the room being the United States, and realizes that there are a lot of people that are not happy with how turbulent the 60s have been, protests and shootings and war and all of this. So he comes on the political scene again in 1968 and campaigns for president with his lovely Vice President Spiro Agnew over there. What a name. But he campaigns for president in 1968 with that very turbulent year with a very appealing slogan, which was law and order. And he preached himself as a politician who would bring back exactly that, law and order. He would bring back normalcy, he would bring back respect for the law, respect for tradition, calmness, peace. He kind of bills himself as someone who is going to look to roll back Vietnam, roll back all of the chaos that people were seeing. And it is very appealing. And Nixon also uses the term silent majority to talk about his constituents, his voters, because he was very adamant that he was going to win because he felt that the it was only a noisy, loud minority of people in America that were pushing for radical change to society. He felt that it was the silent majority, the people that were too good to say anything against the protests. They would come out in droves and vote for Nixon because everybody, most people who say this, the majority of people really did want to go back to traditional values and calmness and peace. And you needed to stand up to that noisy minority of people protesting in the streets with their signs and their banners, staging sit-ins and protesting war and all of this other stuff. He felt that there was too many people in the United States just simply too afraid to stand up against these protesters because they didn't want to seem backwards or anything. So he felt that the silent majority that favored law and order would be very appreciative of his message in the 60s. And he was right, actually, because he does win. Um, he wins kind of narrowly. He doesn't win in a landslide election, but he does win. So that seems to imply that a technical majority of people did like the ideas that Nixon had. He wins pretty narrowly against his Democratic competitor, Hubert Humphrey. And however, I guess you could really start to get very um, technical about this, that maybe Nixon did have much more of a majority than you give him credit for, because both, well, maybe both, but maybe Nixon more so. Nixon, I guess, kind of technically loses votes to a third party candidate that ran in the election of 1968, a guy named George Wallace, who, as you can see, was extremely popular in the Deep South because George Wallace ran on a platform of rolling back civil rights and stopping all of the kind of the gains of any of the like the rights revolution people or people like Martin Luther King. So he was very much a candidate that only really had a lot of sway in the Deep South because that's where a lot of people felt that civil rights had affected their lives so much more. He was kind of wanted to return to segregation and all of this, so he gets a lot of votes from kind of disaffected Southerners. So you have to think that maybe if George Wallace wasn't in the race, then perhaps Nixon would have swept those states as well and had a bit more of a majority. But regardless, both Nixon's victory and even Wallace's, I guess, just doing better than a lot of third candidates do, even his somewhat success of having won a few states, shows that there was a big pushback against all of the changes that had happened in the 60s. There were a lot of disaffected people that were angry with how loud and chaotic the world had gotten. They were tired of all of these protesters and they're just tired of everything. And that gives politicians like Nixon and George Wallace voters. It gives them some ground. So when Nixon takes office in after his victory, he adopts some policies that very quickly reveal that Nixon is not quite as staunchly conservative as he appeals. Um, He's actually pretty middle ground. He's a pretty middle of the road politician. He does a lot of stuff that appeals to more conservative politicians, and he actually does a lot of stuff that appeals to some more liberal politicians and more liberal Americans. So Nixon has a pretty good way of acting and portraying himself. So he comes off as a friend to all. And some of the policies that were more conservative, that were popular with more conservative politicians, one of them was something known as New Federalism. It's a policy that Nixon adopted where he wanted to make sure that federal money, money from the top tier of government, when it's doled out to states in their budgets, the states were allowed to use that money how they saw fit, as opposed to having money from the federal government be dictated by the federal government. So the federal government, the big ones, the president and the Senate and Congress and everything, when they give money to senators and governors and states, usually the federal government, the big one, would tell them how to spend that money. Okay, you have to use this much for healthcare, you have to use this much for infrastructure and schools and so on. But that was very unpopular with a lot of conservative politicians because conservatism generally likes the idea of less federal big government involvement. That there should be less oversight, less manipulation and control by that large, bigger branches of government because um, it ends up costing more, and it's a lot of the arguments are that you can't really, how could the president know exactly what's best for the people of Idaho? The people of Idaho should be electing representatives close to home that should have more say over that state. That kind of breaking it up and giving more power to the states is better for the people who live there because the states at that smaller level, the lower level of government can they've got boots on the ground, they can best represent their people. So that is more a more conservative idea, and Nixon doing this by adopting this new federalist policy that gives more power to the states, it tips the power and tips the balance of power in their favor. This is very appealing because it seems to be deconstructing that idea of a very big, monolithic, huge, powerful, bloated, big federal government that a lot of conservatives dislike. So this is very popular with conservatives, this idea of giving more power to the states. What's kind of popular all around is this is an era of concern for the environment. So Nixon tries to harness that. Look at him planting a tree on the White House lawn. I wonder if that's still there. Probably very big today. But Nixon does a lot of stuff that appeals to calls on either side to do something about protecting some of the issues with the environment that both sides of the political spectrum can recognize as problematic. Nixon is the one who passes the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, creating the agency that is the one responsible for conducting environmental assessments of things like new building projects or infrastructure, setting kind of a national standard for if you want to build some giant mall, you have to first make sure that you're not going to like disturb any wetlands or vital ecosystems first. So it sets standards across the country for making sure that buildings are built correctly, taking into account the environmental impact, and also even sometimes with like making sure that there's no disruption of like archaeological sites. So it's something that gives some teeth to people who want to, you know, bulldoze a wetland to create a strip mall or something. And part of these two are other things that Nixon passes, the Endangered Species Act, which it tries to identify types of plants and animals that are in danger of extinction, and it gives legal protection to try to punish those organizations or entities or people who would cause them harm, you know, building a mall over the site of an endangered butterfly breeding ground. Same thing with the Clean Air and Water Acts, where it was more emission control to make sure that factories weren't pumping smoke out into the air quite so much. They had to have more filters and caps and stop gaps to kind of make sure that they weren't polluting the air so much, and making sure places like factories and manufacturing plants weren't dumping their pollutants into the local streams and then destroying the water supply. So there was a lot of attempts to try to pass laws that would hurt people who did this, not just kind of shame them, but to actually have some type of tangible punishment and law to actually have on the books to make sure that it was viable, that you know there's actually some type of threat, and it de-incentivizes people just dumping stuff in streams because there's actually going to be something that happens if you do that. There will be a punishment. There will be retribution. There will be something that will happen to you if you do that, not just the moral issue of that you shouldn't pollute. Some of the things that made Nixon more popular with more liberal politicians, but extremely unpopular with conservatives, was some of the things he tried to do to increase welfare rights and some of the um, racial actions that he took to try to improve the situation for African Americans and underrepresented minorities in the United States. He was actually a lot more liberal than a lot of Republicans before him, and it did make him very unpopular, as this cartoon depicts. This is people wanting to evict Nixon. There he is with his dog too, sitting out there on the White House lawn. One and some of the things that you could see that people don't like him for. There's, of course, down there the initial FAP. That stands for the Family Assistance Plan. And that was something Nixon proposed where it was going to be a way to try to have some more social support for struggling American families. Um, Something where it would be kind of a negative income tax, where if you made under a certain amount of money, instead of paying taxes, the government would pay you. So there was a kind of a graduated line of how much taxation you would get. And the less money you made, the more chance you had of actually getting money instead of paying money to the government. But a lot of conservatives felt that that was way too radical, that that was going to be just government handouts, and it was going to encourage kind of not working and not wanting to make a lot of money, because then if you just didn't make any money, the government would just pay you to do nothing. So people were very concerned that the family assistance plan would encourage unemployment and kind of vagrancy, and society would fall apart. So there was a lot of concern about that. Nixon also, some of the more liberal things he did was he supported affirmative action, which put in place quotas to make sure that jobs and factories and places of employment had quotas to make sure that they were hiring a certain number of minorities to adequately represent their population. So if you're I don't know, a car factory and you are in a city where the population is 10% black, you're at least 10% of your employees should be black then. Um, so you had to meet a certain quota and hire a certain number of non-white employees to the way it was supposed to, because there had been a lot of exclusion in well-paying jobs. So this was designed to kind of work around it and force companies to adopt these things. So a lot of more conservative politicians felt that this was just too much government intervention in the private sector, the private economic sector, where you should just be letting the companies figure out how to best run themselves and let them do what they want. You shouldn't be interfering quite so much. He also passed Title IX, which was a another civil rights action, which was supposed to discriminate to prohibit sex-based discrimination in anything that is run by the federal government. So, or anything that receives federal funding. So if you have like a school that receives federal funding, they're not allowed to exclude women from sports. They have to, if you're gonna have, or like if you're gonna have, like you're gonna pay a certain amount of money to have a football team, you also have to allocate funds to women's sports as well. So it was designed to also increase some of the benefits for women. That's kind of what Title IX ends up getting known for. Some of them are more popular than others. Some things make Nixon quite unpopular, especially with his conservative constituents. But foreign policy wise, Nixon is very active when it comes to the foreign policy sphere. Nixon tries very hard to normalize relations with communist China and even the USSR. He was, meeting with Khrushchev, discussing dishwashers and stuff back in the late 50s there. He was having a good time. So Nixon is historically the first president to try to make a overtures of friendship to communist China, and he also visits the USSR to try to be pragmatic and realize that, being terrified of one another and treating each other like this is only going to be bad for our countries. We should, even if we don't agree politically, we should try to de-escalate things as much as possible. And the idea of de-escalation was very important because Nixon wanted to do something about the growing stockpile that the United States and the Soviets had of nuclear weapons. So he initiated a series of talks known as the SALT talks, Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, or SALT. And at the time Nixon's president and doing this, the leader of the Soviet Union is a guy named Leonid Brezhnev. So the Soviet leader had changed from Khrushchev to Brezhnev, and Brezhnev is also pretty open to discussing things with Nixon. And during the SALT talks, they both reach an agreement to try to limit the amount of weapons each side has because they realize that at a certain point, both sides are so armed to the teeth that if it ever did turn into nuclear war, they're pretty equally matched. The only thing they would accomplish is death to everybody and destroying the entire planet due to radiation and toxic plumes of like nuclear mushroom clouds everywhere. No one's gonna win if the Cold War turns hot, is what they realize, is that there will be mutually assured destruction if either one of them starts nuking each other. So we better learn to get along and just stop this. So the SALT talks are considered pretty successful because both sides do start to scale back um, their stockpiles of weapons. And this is part of a effort on Nixon's part to do some type of it's like a political philosophy known as détente, which means he's trying détente stands for it kind of it's I think it's a French term. It vaguely translates to like cooperation, thaw, getting along, and that's what he's trying to do. He's trying to thaw the relationship. He's trying to thaw out the Cold War a little bit and maybe even make it go away, make it so that it's slightly less of a immediate threat to the existence of civilization on the planet. And he's trying to just kind of work with communist countries. Sometimes the détente philosophy that Nixon adopts is also sometimes known as realpolitik, which is another fancy German political phrase that essentially just means practical politics. Realpolitik is this idea of just putting aside the fact that you don't agree with someone to just simply get things done and be very pragmatic about it and realize that you can have this lofty philosophical political idea in place, but it's not helping your people, even if you think it's a great idea. So you need to just, come down off your high horse, be realistic about it, get along with people, not try to keep changing the world, grin and bear it. You're supposed to, even if you want to destroy communism, you'd like to see it gone, is it really worth everything that what are you willing to sacrifice for that? Try to be a little bit less ideological and be a bit more practical. And that's what détente is. It is a form of realpolitik, this idea of just trying to make amends if you can, be practical, be pragmatic. Don't destroy communism at the cost of yourself as well, no matter how much you disagree ideologically. So the other thing, we talked a little bit about this previously, but Nixon does get a lot of credit for kind of ending the Vietnam War. A brief review there, his grand plan for doing so when he realized how unpopular it was, there really didn't seem to be any winning of the Vietnam War. His way to save face was the process of Vietnamization, which essentially meant pulling the troops out of Vietnam slowly and surely while proclaiming quite loudly about how successful American troops had been there at training the South Vietnamese, who were the non-communist side, to take over the fighting. And they don't need us anymore. This is great. Of course, as you know, eventually it does the South Vietnam does fall to communism, so it's kind of seen as a bit of a failure. But at the time, Nixon is really on top of the world because he seems to have found the solution to this unwinnable war where you just change the rules a little bit. Like you don't have to win or lose. You just have to say that you did what you went there for. We communism didn't spread, and we've trained the South Vietnamese, so we can go home now. And the Paris Peace Accord was the crown jewel of his achievement there, where the U.S. agreed during these accords to slowly remove their troops, and there would be a ceasefire. But again, it does kind of fall apart. But despite that, Nixon can be given a lot of credit for getting the troops out of Vietnam in probably the least humiliating way possible. He just realizes that it's going to cost a lot more American lives, a lot of money, and it probably would have cost him his support at home if he had tried to just pour troops into Vietnam to win it. So this is a good, very political solution, very carefully weighed out solution to the Vietnam War. But Nixon's doing really well. He's very popular, generally for a president. No president can ever, you can't please all the people all the time. But Nixon's doing a pretty good job. so far. And he's given a lot of credit for being open to ideas of others across the political spectrum, ending the Vietnam War, initiating détente with foreign powers that Americans have been scared of. But Nixon himself is, despite all of his victories and his popularity, Nixon is a kind of a paranoid individual. He is always always been very concerned about his own popularity and his own hold on power. Like he's just absolutely terrified about losing his reelection campaign when it comes up. So what happens is that things kind of start to go awry for Nixon when in 1971 some classified reports end up being leaked to the New York Times that they're known as the Pentagon Papers, this classified reports leak. The Pentagon Papers revealed to the American people that during Lyndon Johnson's time in office, he had concealed a lot of what was going on in Vietnam from the American people, that they had been pouring more troops in than the American people had realized, that they were just dumping way more money into it than the American people realized, and doing their best to cover their tracks so that Americans wouldn't know that that was happening. So, and that the Pentagon Papers even revealed secret documents that um, the American government had had designs on being in Vietnam for much longer. So they had just this longer, deeper involvement than American people had realized. And in 1971, when this is leaked, the Pentagon Papers is leaked, Nixon is terrified because, first of all, it happens under his watch. Like he's in office, he's the big man in charge when these secrets are leaked. So he feels kind of scared that, okay, things are not as tight around here as they should be. Something's going on, and the fact that classified reports are able to make their way out of the secure areas while he's in office, he doesn't really like that. But he also doesn't really like the fact that um, it seems it really erodes Americans' faith in their government. Um, Nixon realizes that the Pentagon Papers fiasco makes a lot of Americans even more concerned about the government lying. As you can see in the cartoon, the documents showed duplicity in Vietnam, and everyone seems concerned. But of course, younger people had been kind of suspicious of the government's motives for years regarding Vietnam. Um, but what really the Pentagon Papers is very concerning for Nixon because it does lead to an erosion of faith in the government. It was another blow after the concealment that the government had attempted to do after the My Lai massacre, where the troops killed a lot of South Vietnamese civilians during the conflict. So there's a lot of lack of trust in the government and just this idea that doesn't matter who's in office, the government's kind of corrupt. And this was new. This was something that after My Lai and after the Pentagon Papers, it just, I think faith in government really went down. And that had not been something that was the case. Before Vietnam War, most Americans, a hefty majority of them, felt that the government worked with just sterling integrity, that they were a very trustworthy organization. And now, the 1960s, 1970s, the government is just very sleazy, very underhanded, like just kind of dirty. And Nixon doesn't like that this is the new idea of the government. So he organizes a group known as the Plumbers, which this is probably the most creative name for anything ever, because the purpose of the Plumbers are to stop leaks. Get it? Plumbers stop leaks. Well, Nixon's plumbers are a group of kind of covert agents that work for him that are spread throughout the government and designed to make sure that nothing like the Pentagon Papers happens ever again. There will be no more leaking of classified government information ever again. And Nixon is going to make sure of that. So Nixon gives the plumbers a pretty blank check to do whatever they want to make sure that nothing bad about the government ever makes its way into the hands of Americans ever again, especially anything bad about Richard Nixon, because Richard Nixon is building up to a re-election campaign. In June 1972, Richard Nixon's plumbers end up breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters at the Watergate apartment complex in Washington, D.C., which is pictured here, in order to try to find anything that they can use to try to help Nixon win re-election, see if they can find anything there that um, might it might be anything bad about Nixon they can get rid of. So they go in there with just the attempt to try to help Nixon. They're thinking, we're going to break in, we're going to see if the Democrats have any dirt on them or if there was any dirt we can find on them. So they break into the Watergate complex. They also try to plant some wiretaps because they're thinking they want to listen in on what the Democrats are planning. And they end up getting caught and arrested by a security guard, the plumbers, but not really too much comes of it. It's just seen as some low-level political tampering that, oh yeah, maybe they're just some low-level little punks that want to come in and cause some mischief. So the Watergate break-in into this hotel, it's not really traced back up to Nixon. It doesn't really go too far. Americans are much more concerned about the ongoing political election of the time. And when the results of the election of 1972 are out and the election is done, it turns out that Nixon, boy, he had absolutely nothing to worry about because he was still very popular with the majority of Americans. He is reelected in the election of 1972 with just over 60% of the popular vote and a massive, massive majority in the electoral votes, as you can see by the bar up top. He wins every single state of the United States except DC and Massachusetts, which was where his political rival George McGovern was from. Actually, no, I take that back. Sorry, George McGovern was from South Dakota. Massachusetts just happened to be a lot more liberal, but George McGovern was not even able to win South Dakota. That's how popular Nixon was across the board. So Nixon ends up winning re-election, and things seem to be coming up Nixon. Things seem to be going very, very well for him because he is he's been reelected. He's been reelected with a great majority, so it seems that he is doing very well politically. However, things as things keep moving along, as they often do, in 1973, as those Watergate plumbers that broke into the apartment complex go through a trial for having broken into political headquarters and planting wiretaps, it comes out that it does go all the way up to Nixon. Wow, they've uncovered the scandal of the century. That break-in was something that Nixon had a connection to. And what happens is with the Watergate scandal for Nixon, as they try the plumbers, it comes out that Nixon probably hadn't ordered them to do that and probably hadn't planned it. But what really gets Nixon in trouble is it gets revealed during trial that Nixon had not given them any boundaries, so that's a little concerning. But that when Nixon knew about it, he didn't chastise them for it. Like he didn't get the plumbers in trouble and own up to it and say, yeah, I've got these people working for me, but I don't condone what they did. He doesn't do anything to own up to it or stop it, which might have cut this all off at the path. Instead of admitting to it and just kind of owning up to it, Nixon tries to cover it up. He tries to cover up that he had any connection to the plumbers, that he created them in the first place. He really just tries to stall and get rid of his involvement in any way. And that's really what does Nixon in. It's not the break-in to the Watergate apartment complex. It's the fact that Nixon doesn't own up to it in the first place, and the fact that he tries to just hide it and make and act like he had no idea these people even existed. What plumbers? Who are they? Never heard of it. Sorry. Nixon did not order that break-in. He probably didn't even know about it till after it happened. But when they get caught, he gets in a lot of trouble for just trying to hide it. And that duplicity, that idea of lying is again what suddenly makes Nixon incredibly unpopular. Um, and as the trial continues, the plumbers reveal that Nixon had bribed them to remain silent, and that's another dirty deed. And then when Nixon is under oath talking about, what did you know about the plumbers? He says absolutely nothing. That's a big fat lie. That's called perjury, and that's a federal crime if you lie under oath. So, and Nixon was also in a lot of trouble because he bribed the plumbers to lie under oath. So he encouraged even further. There's perjury all over the place. It's just horrible. And then Nixon also gets in even more trouble because he tries to bring in the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, to impede this investigation because it's the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that is trying to solve this crime, this break-in, who ordered it, where did it go, how far up, who do you get in trouble for this? He was trying to get the CIA to stop the investigation, um, and it just implodes on Nixon. Everything he worked for is just kind of implodes because of this scandal at the Watergate break-in. It can be a little complex because there's a lot of legal stuff going on with it. But the biggest thing is that Nixon is not really in trouble for the break-in. He's in trouble for how he handled it. And kind of in trouble for having created the plumbers in the first place because it seems to be the action of a very paranoid, angry, suspicious man, to have this kind of covert force working for him and then trying to impede the whole investigation the entire way and lie, outright lie to people. So that's really, it's the handling of the Watergate break-in that does Nixon in. Uh, Fun fact, while all this is going on, Nixon's administration is falling apart. Nixon becomes known as a liar, a cheat, a very duplicitous, underhanded individual, and it's not helped by the fact that his illustrious Vice President Spiro Agnew is also in a lot of trouble for completely other things. He was, as the scrutiny bears down on the Nixon administration, it comes out as they start to beat the bushes and shake out all of and have a closer eye on Nixon and Agnew's administration. It's revealed that Agnew was doing some pretty serious tax evasion and also accepting a lot of bribes. So Agnew is forced to resign in the middle of all of this, and the vice president's gone. The president's a big liar. Americans that had wanted law and order are sorely disappointed. And Nixon is, once it comes out, there are some tapes recorded in his office that end up doing him in. There's kind of a smoking gun to this case where the FBI finds some recordings from the Oval Office that basically is Nixon saying, yeah, cover it up, make sure nobody finds out about this. And that idea is known as obstruction to justice. Um, Conspiracy, there's a lot of legal terms, there's a lot of legal things Nixon did that were illegal. A lot of legalese going on here. But because of everything he did, specifically for obstructing justice, for encouraging perjury, for lying about everything, Nixon is going to face impeachment or removal from office. And in that whole scene where Nixon is really on the chopping block to face an impeachment trial, he decides to simply resign because he realizes, again, he's a very good politician when he does put his mind to it. He realizes that he is not going to win, probably. He's probably not going to win an impeachment trial. He's probably going to be removed from office because the evidence is pretty stark against him that he lied, that he tried to cover this up, that he tried to hide what happened, tried to hide the creation of the plumbers, tried to hide his connection to the break-in, tried to cover things up. Um, he also, so he, and he is, he makes history again for being the first president in all of American history to resign from office. A couple of them have died in office, but Nixon is the first one to walk away. And the American people are just kind of thrown for a loop because who's the president now? Gerald Ford, pictured down there next to Nixon. Who even is this man? He's the guy that had to quick step in for the vice president after Agnew resigned. He's like one of those other lower level, like Secretary of State type of people that is brought into he ascends to the office of vice president because Agnew resigns. Now Nixon resigns, so whoops, who's this? Gerald Ford. He's the president. Surprise. So Americans are in for quite the shock when Nixon resigns because now they've got someone they hardly know as president. But one of the assignments you'll have, one of the sources will be Nixon's resignation speech because when Nixon resigns, he makes it extremely, extremely clear to the American people, or tries to paint it as a favor to them, that he's doing it in the best interest of the nation, that he doesn't want them to drag them through a spectacle trial, to waste money on it, to cause even more emotional strain on them. So he decides he's stepping down, not for himself. He doesn't want to be seen as a quitter or giving up, but he doesn't want to subject the American people to this. So we'll have a little viewing of that too. But despite Nixon's sudden, very quick unpopularity, there is a lot of there's still a lot of conservative sentiment in the United States. It doesn't all of a sudden evaporate with Nixon's uh, shameful retreat from the presidential office and sudden being suddenly painted as a criminal. It's still a very strong sentiment, the conservative sentiment, and it had been growing before, during, and continues after Nixon. So I just want to look to some more kind of lower level political stuff because we've been talking about very high level politics and the president and whatnot. So let's look at some things going on for the average American here. A lot of Americans at the time, if they were conservative, they were of a sect known as neoconservatism or new conservatism. And neoconservatives were people who were much more intellectual, maybe, like they were more college educated than conservatives of the past. In past decades, people who voted liberal tended to be more college educated, and people who voted conservative tended to not be college educated. But now you have a lot more college educated conservatives, so they consider themselves kind of the new or neoconservatives. And they are very concerned with a decline in morality and how the 60s seemed to destroy respect for authority that allowed the country to exist and operate and go smoothly. There wasn't respect for parents or for the law or for politicians. And they're really trying to make sure that that changes. They're trying to um, keep things keep that law and order thing going, even though Nixon ends up kind of torpedoing it. But also just trying to keep tradition in place. That's the 60s had tried so hard to destroy tradition, but tradition is what keeps the world orderly. And neoconservatives really wanted to protect what they respected, and to protect the sort of gender roles and all those other type of like family structure that they felt was under attack from the 60s. And one of the most well-known conservative leaders, real figurehead of the neoconservative movement, was a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who is pictured over here. And one of the things that she was very vocal about as a conservative was to protect women from the feminist movement. She felt that feminism was destroying everything women had worked for, and that feminism was hurting women, not helping them. Um, she was very much opposed to something that was going to be voted on, known as the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment. And the Equal Rights Amendment was going to be something that was going to add a amendment to the Constitution that would just absolutely eliminate um, any type of reference to sex, that equality under the law would be just totally sex blind. And it sounds like, on for a lot of women, it sounds like a nice thing on paper, total political legal equality across the board. No distinction between men and women anywhere. Everything has to be totally equal. But the neoconservatives like Schlafly were very frightened that the Equal Rights Amendment would take away their privileges that women enjoyed by having legal distinctions for women, and they create a group to stop that, known as STOP, to stop taking our privileges. And the women in STOP argued quite vigorously that the Equal Rights Amendment it sounds good for women, but it's only going to hurt them. Schlafly was one of her biggest arguments was that the Equal Rights Amendment was going to make women eligible for the draft, because that was a legal thing. That was that war's on, you need people for combat. Who gets drafted? Who gets told it's time to go to war? It's men. Why aren't women drafted? Because they're women. And if there's no legal protections for women, if there's no distinction on a legal base, war breaks out. Guess what, ladies? You pick up a gun too. And Schlafly really uh, whipped up a lot of terror regarding the possibility of women being drafted, that you want some inequality, ladies, because if you have that separation, it will protect you from things like being drafted. She emphasized the fact that, what happens when there's a divorce? the children often go with the women because they're recognized as women. If you get rid of that distinction, women, you get divorced, ladies. Oh, guess what? Your husband, your ex-husband's gonna get the kids. There won't be any privileges left. There won't be um any protections. There won't be any uh leeway for women. What about work requirements where women might get hurt because they're going to be treated just like a man and they're not strong enough or they're not tall enough. What about sex crimes where you have assault and rape? What if something like that happens? Is that not going to be punished anymore? She's very, very good at um kind of stirring up that concern, so much so that when the time comes to vote on the Equal Rights Amendment, it doesn't pass because there is a lot of hesitation and suspicion that it will indeed take privileges and that the taking of privileges needs to stop. So there's a little bit kind of an exploration of this backlash against the changes of the 60s, against everything from protests all the way to feminism. And the next lecture is going to explore a bit more of the high politics as well and go into what happens during the next couple presidencies because there are some important things both domestically and abroad that Americans are faced with during the 60s, during the rest of the 70s and into the 80s that are very, very important and have pretty long-standing consequences for the rest of the century. Um, and it is a lot of high politics too, because you're talking about presidents, because now this is what the president does seems to affect Americans more, or at least they're just much more aware of it during this time because more people have TVs, they're watching this. Um, National issues seem to affect more people the more globalized, the more interconnected the world comes. And a lot of the stuff that presidents are dealing with in the 70s and 80s are things that do affect Americans in their day-to-day lives.